So what I want to do today is talk about exploring the transformative power of music, this neurological perspective. Now, we're all familiar with the idea that music can transport us in the moment, can bring back amazing memories or change our emotions and maybe absorb us and make the rest of the world sort of melt away, even when we're listening by ourselves. Also, music in groups can have amazing effects in the moment, connecting us emotionally to the people around us or to the spiritual. But what kind of lasting effects can musical engagement have on our brain? That's what I'll talk about in the first part of the talk, so beyond music in the moment. And did we evolve to be an inherently musical species? This is an old question, and it's an exciting time to be studying it, and that'll be the focus of the second part. But let's start with the first part. And I want to start with non-fluent aphasia and singing. Aphasia is a language problem that follows brain damage, often stroke to the left hemisphere. Now, it's a really serious problem because people haven't lost their intelligence, but they have real trouble finding words, putting them together in coherent phrases, and communicating. And you know how important language is to our daily life. This can be devastating. And what's been striking and known since the 1700s, the first reports were that sometimes the same people who seem like they can't get 2 or 3 words together out in a coherent phrase can sing fluently, and to the point where you wouldn't know anything was wrong when they're singing a song they know well. And to me, this was a striking thing, and it kind of was my entry point into thinking about, could there be parts of the brain specialized for music? Could it be that speech and singing are using sort of entirely different brain regions? And what would that mean for the evolution of that ability, singing as a separate ability that we have? So this was pre-internet, so I remember going to the Boston VA hospital where some research was being done on this, and going through papers on microfiche, okay? Do you remember microfiche? So pre-World Wide Web, these little spools, and you put them up on these machines and like look, squint and look at papers and articles written hundreds of years ago or 50 years ago, and learning about this. And we've come a long way since then, and we can ask this question differently now. Are speech and singing entirely different brain functions? And we can use fancy brain imaging and get pictures of the brain when somebody sings and see what areas are involved. And then we can do the same thing when they speak and see what areas are involved. And what we've learned is they're not completely separate. It's more like, if you remember high school Venn diagrams, kind of like partly overlapping circles. So if you imagine the blue circle represents the neurological processes involved in speech and the red in singing, it's not like they're completely separate. In the brain, there's some overlap. And in fact, the parts that are separate aren't necessarily doing completely different things. They're kind of doing maybe variations on a theme. So you can think of like different mechanisms, but somewhat related, like different kinds of gears, but not totally different. And that's important because through training the brain and what's called brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to change with training and experience, maybe some of those singing circuits could actually be recruited to help people recover speech, because they're partly overlapping with speech, and some of the things they're doing aren't radically different. So with retraining, maybe they could recover. You could actually leverage the fact that people can still sing to help them speak. And that's exactly the idea behind melodic intonation therapy, a therapy first discovered and created at the Boston VA hospital, where I'd been in the basement looking at microfiche, and that's why I went there to meet one of the originators of that therapy. Melodic intonation therapy takes advantage of the fact that people can be fluent when they still sing and creates kind of song-like versions of speech, just with 2 pitches and with simple phrases like, I love you, I love my children, and so forth. And the patient works on this with a therapist, repeating after them and speaking to kind of a beat, and starts to build up fluency for phrases, spoken phrases. First stock phrases, but then ultimately phrases of original things they want to say. And this is now one of the most widespread therapies for non-fluent aphasia, because there's no drugs and no surgery that can really cure this disease at the moment. And what's exciting is people are now understanding how and why this works. So my colleague, Dr. Gottfried Schlaug, who was a neurologist at Harvard Medical School, did some research on melodic intonation therapy and what's changing in the brains of patients as they recover some speech function and the ability to express speech after going through this therapy. And he looked at these 2 giant fiber paths in the brain. So that's a see-through view of a human brain. The head is sort of tilted down, the nose is sort of down, and you're seeing on the left towards you and the right further away from you tracks, these are information superhighways that carry brain signals, neural impulses from the hearing centers of the brain to the motor centers of the brain. And the one on the left is particularly important for speech. That was very damaged in the patients that he studied that had non-fluent aphasia. But after they'd gone through this therapy, he did structural imaging of their brains, he found this information superhighway on the right had actually gotten stronger through this therapy and somehow seemed to be compensating for the damaged one on the left. And so regular singing through this therapeutic program was actually changing the structure of the brain, and the brain was recovering some of its ability to speak through these changes in structure. So this is an example of how the clinical research, clinical application, and basic research are coming together to show that this can actually work for people and we can understand the mechanisms behind it. This is just one of the mechanisms. But it's important to understand how and why this works in the brain to create the best therapies and to get support for this kind of therapy from the medical community.